civics education is at such a low point. If you don't have basic civic understanding of how governments work, the checks and balances, how compromise is needed, it's very easy for people to retreat to their respective corners and not come to agreement, not come to solutions, and then ultimately, in the worst case, doubt the very ability of government to find those solutions to these problems we've been talking about.
My guest today is cybersecurity strategist Glenn Gerstell. Glenn is an attorney, author, and former counsel to the National Security Agency. While he's now a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, he's had an illustrious career in public service, including as a presidential appointee to the National Infrastructure Advisory Council under the Obama administration.
If we start banning TikTok, who do we look like? We look like China. We start to look like China. And it's just a bad thing. We're far better off coming up with a solution that can ameliorate 98% of the risk and still preserve our ability to go around the world and say we are the country of freedom and free expression.
Glenn is a leading voice on the threat of Russia and their disinformation campaigns, on the growing cyber threat that is the Chinese Communist Party, and the need for better security in the U.S. supply chain.
It's probably true that a true cyber attack that really causes kinetic effects, shuts down the national electric grid, shuts down the New York Stock Exchange, etc. But the fascinating part is below that threshold, there's room for a ton of mischief and tremendous societal cost, billions of dollars lost to cybersecurity.
Now, Glenn and I had a deep conversation, covered all kinds of topics. He's a fascinating guy with a lot of experience and knowledge to share. And now, here is Glenn Gerstell. Glenn, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Typically, when we start a podcast, we like to start in like the kind of who are you, what's your background, and we're going to skip all that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. We'll cover that.
All right.
But you're the first person who's shown up with what looks to be copious notes. And like right before we start recording, I could see we're itching to get into content.
Absolutely. And then there's a test after this too, right? Quiz.
Hold on, is it for me?
Yeah, for you. For you. That's why I got all the notes. Yeah.
All right, maybe we shouldn't do this.
Open book exam. Okay.
Okay, I'll take the open book exam for sure.
Yeah.
So let's start the conversation because there's so many different things to explore here. I want to start it in your New York Times op-ed that you wrote a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. First off, loved the op-ed, and I love the way you framed the cybersecurity challenge, where you talked about, I think we have like a National Security Operations Center and a Missile Defense Center, and they're kind of interconnected. And they're all set up so that on a moment's notice, when we detect the missile inbound, boom, they can call the president, activate everything. We got 30 minutes, an hour, whatever prep time to deal with this kinetic threat. Wonderful as a citizen to know we have all this amazing apparatus to protect us against, belligerents like North Korea launching missiles and whatnot. And remember, we had that thing in Hawaii a couple of years ago where they activated that system, unintentionally. Beautiful that we have all that. But then you juxtapose that against, and we don't have any of that for cybersecurity necessarily. Like there is no 30-minute anticipation and reaction time in the cyber domain. It's instantaneous or near instantaneous. I think you also talked about hypersonic missiles as these emerging new threats that we seem not to be totally prepared for. And if I could steal a bit of your thunder, I'm going to talk about what you describe as implications of the fourth industrial revolution.
The digital revolution. Yep.
Right. Where we're at today and some of the major implications there. One of which I'll summarize as, our reach with technology seems to be exceeding our grasp to fully understand it, rein it in, get control of it. AI, I know, is something that we'll spend a lot of time talking about there. But that's a risk that our reach exceeds our grasp. We have the persistent state of cyber war that we're headed into, if not already there. One of the things I think that no one's thinking about, which I love that you bring up, is the power that this is giving to private entities. It's a third implication of you have private companies. We all know some of the big names we could say, and the power they're amassing in this digital revolution, where you have private entities that are more powerful than governments, and not just little governments. They have major effect on big governments. And then finally, and one that I think we live day to day now, fourth implication, what I'll call the undermining of institutions. Now, if I'm characterizing anything incorrectly, let me know. Mm-hmm. But that fourth implication you brought up, where there's a lot of uncertainty around the legitimacy of institutions, around the legitimacy of our government, the effect that I think social media is having, and how AI is now going to reach social media. It paints this picture like we have some big challenges in front of us. And the one quote I'm going to steal, and then I got to let you start going with this. I'm going to steal your quote that I loved because I keyed in on it. You said, bluntly put, there are few signs that our society overall and our political leaders have fully embraced the challenge or appreciate the risks of failure. And boy, as a cybersecurity practitioner, do I feel that in my bones. Right. So what a tremendous backdrop for what I think can be a phenomenal conversation. Where do you want to start?
Wow, you've covered.
I stole all your thunder. I know.
Yeah, no, beautiful. But we could spend anywhere from a few minutes summarizing it to literally days and days talking about all this because the implications are so rich and it's such a significant thing. But let's maybe take a step back to cover a couple of those points. So first, we all know that we face incredible cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities right now.
Yeah.
And although this is obvious and people have talked about it, I still think it bears repeating in some analysis of why cyber is different. You talked about, how we have a chance to know if missiles are attacking us and we can do something about it. We can deter them also. Cyber threats are completely different. And I think, again, this is an obvious stuff, but I think it's worth thinking about because of the ramifications of it. So cyber and cyber vulnerabilities are unique. We haven't until fairly recently had to deal with this problem. Of course, it wasn't all that long ago when you said something about cybersecurity, you were talking about getting an email from a Nigerian prince who was asking you for your bank account number.
We get a lot of those too.
And that was cybersecurity.
Never got my money back.
Yeah, exactly. Well, okay. Anyway, that was cybersecurity, and the bad guys in the cyber realm went from stealing your bank account to maybe getting your credit card number to maybe spoofing your existence to your bank or your financial company to ransomware to doxing, distributing online millions of documents of personally significant information, et cetera. So just every day you pick up the paper, so to speak, metaphorically, but not the literal paper these days, but the electronic version of the paper. You still can get them. I still get them. You pick up the paper, read a newsletter, online newsletter, whatever, and it's full of cybersecurity breaches, some of which are very significant. So why are they different? Well, obviously, cyber is different from a kinetic action. So if you think back to, I don't know whether it was 2014, 2012, something like that, where Sony Pictures produced a film against sort of spoofing the North Korean dictator. And obviously North Korea wasn't too happy about it. So what did they do? Instead of sending a missile launched from North Korea to Southern California, where Sony Pictures was headquartered, I think Culver City, wherever, they launched a cyber attack on Sony Pictures, destroying tens of millions of dollars of their computers, just turning them into bricks, so to speak. And had it instead been a missile landing on the top of the Sony Pictures building there, we know what the reaction would be. The United States would have a B-52 bomber over North Korea pretty quickly,
We'd
right?
still be doing it.
Right, exactly. So, and yet it was perfectly okay on some level for a private sector company to suffer a direct attack from a foreign government. And we see that the private sector is bearing the burden of these foreign-generated cyber attacks. And because they are perceived to be below the threshold of an act of war, just international law does not regard that as warranting allowing the United States to send over a B-52 bomber, where we wouldn't do that if there's an attack, a ransomware attack. Look at SolarWinds sponsored SolarWinds attack on the United States federal government executive branch. Went undetected for months, by the way. Another interesting factor about cyber attacks, you don't necessarily know they're happening. If a missile lands, we know it happens. But that doesn't necessarily require either a kinetic response. We're not sending tanks rolling across the NATO border into Russia. We're not launching missiles. Maybe we might respond in cyber, which may or may not be known. Maybe we might impose some economic sanctions. Maybe we might try to indict the perpetrators, the individual perpetrators, if we could find them, as the Department of Justice has done in some cyber crimes where we've gone after Chinese and Iranian, North Korean and Russian individuals where they're able to locate them. But We've got the factors that it can happen instantaneously, and we don't know, and we may not know about it. Attribution is very difficult. It used to take years to figure out, or not years, it used to take months, let's say, to figure out who was the actual perpetrator behind a cyber attack. And now we've been able to reduce that through technical means to a much shorter period of time. But it's not instantaneous. So the minute a cyber attack occurs, we don't know for sure exactly who are the pair of hands, so to speak, on a keyboard made perhaps halfway around the world. And why is that? Well, of course, we all know the internet allows anonymity. There's that famous New Yorker cartoon that says two dogs talking to each other, looking at a computer screen, with one saying, on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. And, that's the foundational principle of the internet. It wasn't designed for purposes of
not a bug.
To prevent misuse. It was designed to allow anonymity. And originally, the purpose of it was to allow communications between academic computers known to each other. People picked up the phone and said, I'm going to send you a message now. And you hung up the phone and you got a message. And it was a very physical element to that nature of the communication. Obviously not the case. So attribution is a huge issue. Anonymity is a huge issue. The ability to detect something. And then most importantly, the nature of the effect is not necessarily one that, as I said, gives rise to an act of war. If all that happens is you steal some money, that's a crime. That's probably not really an act of war. If you get access to some documents that you shouldn't have, unauthorized access to documents, again, probably not an act of war. If you turn off the electricity in the middle of winter, as Russia did to Ukraine in 2015, and again on a couple other subsequently since, maybe that has a physical, real-world effect that maybe could give rise to an act of war. What about a ransomware attack, such as Colonial Pipelines, that just causes gasoline stations up and down the east coast of the United States to shut down because they don't have deliveries of fuel because Colonial Pipelines.
Blurry line forming here.
Colonial Pipelines had to turn off the spigot, so to speak, because their billing system was attacked. This was not an attack on the pipelines themselves. Remember, Colonial Pipelines, it was an attack on their billing and accounting system. And they said, if that's off, we don't know who we're selling to, we don't know who's buying it, we don't know what quantity is going through.
It's as effective as shutting it off.
Just effect. So is that an act of war? Probably not. So for all those various reasons, cyber is, and there are others too, is a very different threat. And it's one that, maybe the last comment, it's one that's ubiquitously present, which is to say that on the vulnerability side, all of America, all of our countries is vulnerable. There's no part that's safe, not only information technology, but operational technology, which we should talk about in a minute. Also, so everyone is potentially vulnerable. Why? Because we're all connected online, right? And that's the beauty of it. That's the advantage of the digital revolution, which is that it allows these extraordinary benefits, but also hand in hand with extraordinary vulnerabilities. And on the other side, almost anybody overseas, let alone domestic criminals, has the ability to interfere with our lives here. And so that leads to a very profound implication, which we could spend more time on, which is that, ever since the United States was a global power, say around the time of the Spanish-American War, or certainly 15 years later by World War I, when the U.S. was unquestionably a global power, when we worried about foreign threats, they manifested themselves overseas. It was wars in Europe, wars in Asia, wars elsewhere. We weren't too worried about foreign threats manifesting themselves in the United States. Yes, there were some exceptions. During World War II, some German agents tried to get into Long Island. Of course, there's the famous and horrific 9/11 incident. But by and large, we dealt with foreign threats overseas. And now, with the advent of cyber, it's possible for someone sitting at a keyboard at the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg to directly affect our well-being, our national well-being here in the United States. And that's a very different phenomenon.
And that do you think through American history, I mean, to your point, since we've been a global power, we've never really felt the kinetic impact of conflict here. Certainly not in the lower 48. We have Hawaii, but it's been very rare, with the exception of 9/11, that we have felt something kinetic in that way.
Exactly, and obviously with the pandemic, we've seen that. So all of this is the product. To go back to our earlier comment about the fourth industrial revolution, the digital revolution, which is it's created extraordinary benefits, right? Just unbelievable benefits of the internet connectivity. We now have some 8 billion cell phone users around the world, more than every man, woman, and child on the planet, by the way. And it's enabled you, yes, to open up your garage door from halfway around the world. It's enabled unbelievable logistics.
I did that this weekend.
Exactly. Unbelievable logistics, fabulous communication, almost inconceivable.
It's changing the way of life. I mean,
totally changing the way of life. And we should talk about that, also about how that's different from other prior technologies. But it's brought about some exceptional vulnerabilities. And with this adoption of digital technology around the world, it's made us more interconnected, more interdependent. There have been lots of books, Thomas Friedman's books on globalization and others all point to the incredibly powerful forces driving greater efficiency and globalization and interconnectedness and dependence, but that means more vulnerabilities. So what happens in China does not stay in China anymore. It affects us here. And we saw that certainly with the pandemic, but we've even seen it with port logistics. We've seen it with shortages of rare minerals. We've seen it in numerous ways where, again, because we're not really operating as a self-sufficient country the way we largely were 100 years ago, it's true, dependent on some foreign trade, but now we are completely dependent on all sorts of commercial and business issues and geopolitical issues that happen anywhere around the world that directly affect our lives here in the United States, all because of digital technology. And we're not ready to really embrace that risk.
No, and wow, there's so many areas of this. So, to me, the fourth industrial revolution, this broad topic, I mean, the net benefit is so significant.
Absolutely.
The positive change to the way of life. Like it's not, I haven't heard anyone seriously suggest it, but I'm sure there is a bit of a regressionist move where it's like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. One, I think that cat's out of the bag. I don't think
we can't, to use the silly proverb, you can't put the toothpaste back in the
right.
So we're here. We're not changing.
Right.
And not only are we not going back, the future is irrevocably set for us. We know we're going to be doing more advancing. There's no way we can stop the inventions and human ingenuity, and we can't turn that off. And we know where we're going. We have a sense with AI that some of these are going to be incredibly transformational changes coming up to us. We can talk more about that too. But we know the trend. It's clear, and it's irreversible. That's the clear. There are only a real tiny handful of areas where, for moral reasons, ethical reasons, we've said, stop, we're not going to do that. And of course, one example is human experimentation. We don't do experiments on humans. Good reasons, right? Yep. That's probably not going to change. I hope not. We're probably not going to be cloning humans, at least not for the immediately foreseeable future.
We'll do gene editing.
But we will be, we're encroaching on it. So we're going to be doing some gene editing. And you could envision, maybe 50 years from now, we will be cloning limbs or individuals or something. There's a fabulous book called Hacking Darwin by my friend Jamie Metzel that talks about how year after year we're going to be getting, there's a couple segments, themes in the book where a woman goes to her obstetrician and in 1 year and asks, could we check for sickle cell anemia? And yes, we can do the genetic test for that. But what about 10 or 15 years from now when the woman goes, or perhaps it's a test tube baby, and says, we'd like to make sure that our son has red hair. And oh, by the way, we'd like him to be a little outgoing, but not too outgoing. Yeah. And can we do that? Well, maybe.
Just the philosophical and moral landscape here is going to be such a minefield to walk through. But I love the way you characterize, like, we know that's where it's going. There's no stopping that.
Absolutely not.
We know that we can use technology. We've seen things like CRISPR where we can do gene editing. We can see the start of that. You can easily see a situation where, we can get to the point you can design your baby.
Right. Exactly.
And will that be morally acceptable? Right. Will it be legally allowed? There's so much to step on just in that one area.
As I said, I think we now have a sense that that's about to overwhelm us with artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And I don't want to spend a lot of time because we could spend the entire time on just AI alone, and you've got people way more expert in it than me. But as I was thinking about talking to you earlier today as we're just thinking about our conversation, how we might touch on AI, somehow the image came into me in my mind of myself as a little kid at the seashore, playing as a little kid with waves as they would come in, and I would sense there'd be a really big wave, and by really big, I probably meant 4 feet at the time, right?
Big wave.
A big wave for a little kid. And I'd sense that this was coming, and I wouldn't quite know whether it would hit me exactly, or I could ride it out, or whether I should run to shore,
break in time.
right? Where it was going to break, or maybe I should run to shore to mommy and daddy and be safe. So I wasn't quite sure where exactly how it was going to break, but I knew it was significant. I knew it was going to be significant one way or the other, but I didn't know exactly what it was going to happen. And although that's not a really great analogy, my sense is we collectively feel that way a little bit about AI. We absolutely recognize and sense that it's going to have a transformational, a largely overused word, but appropriate in this case, transformational effect on our society. But yet we don't quite know what that effect will be. And we do have a sense around the world that we should not replicate the failures we had with the beginning of the internet and the failure to regulate it and shape it and prevent misuse and bad outcomes with the internet. We have that sense we should probably try to nip that in the bud with AI. Of course, it's very hard because we don't know where it's going. We've seen some nascent attempts in European regulation, Chinese regulation, not so much the US, although we're talking about it now. So we have a sense that we need to regulate this in some way. And of course, the danger is we overregulate it and hurt innovation and hurt the benefits. The negative is we have too loose a regulation and we lead to all sorts of terrible outcomes, which you can envision. So getting that right is going to be very tricky. It's going to be one of the defining challenges for the next 5 or 10 years, for sure. But it's illustrative of the kind of changes that technology is throwing at us very quickly before we have time to adapt to it.
Yeah, it feels a bit like we kind of have to design the FAA while the Wright brothers are still doing their thing. Like,
exactly.
You can't really impede that to get to the result we've gotten to. Yep. But you also don't want all the payment in blood of the development of those technologies.
And in fact, you're talking about the Wright brothers and the FAA is a really good segue as well as an analogy into talking about the history of technology. I had occasion to do a little more research into that for a speech I gave a year or so ago on something. And again, there are academicians and experts in this area who are far deeper in this than me. But just from my sort of layman's point of view, it was just fascinating to look at how almost every time a new invention has come on the scene, it's taken a period of time before it became impactful in everyday commercial and personal life. And just think of the electricity, right? Think of how many decades it took before it really became a truly significant thing, but maybe 20 or 30 years before it really had a effect on a large percentage of people. Of the invention of the telephone,
cars,
automobiles. In fact, automobiles, take that as an example. So automobiles were invented in basically the late 1890s. They were regarded sort of as a toy up until very early in the 1900s, and then people started buying them. And of course, with the advent of the Model T, we saw a tremendous uptake and pickup in this. But for the first, maybe 50 years, half a century of the automobile, it was a dangerous instrument. And if you go back and look at some old movies in the 40s and 50s, one of the standard ways of killing off a character in these old movies was to have them be thrown out of a car. And you'd watch an old movie, and the plot line would involve someone ejected from a car and being killed, taken out. Very sad, obviously, but it was just accepted as a given. And it took until the 1960s, before we had mandatory seatbelts, right? And so there's a 50, 60 year period before we had really substantive regulation. That was only one of the regulations. But if you look at airplanes, you mentioned airplanes. So airplanes from Kitty Hawk to the 1934 airplane crash involving Newt Rockne, it made the famous football coach. It made headlines around the country that he and a U.S. senator had died in a plane crash. That galvanized the country, and within weeks, legislation had been introduced in Congress to create what is the forerunner of the National Transportation Safety Board. And whereas air traffic control had been really In fact, originally it was a state issue, became a federal issue, and it took decades. The internet, while it was maybe a little slow to take up after its initial invention in the before the 2000s, we forget because it's so ubiquitous, it's so involved in our everyday life that we don't stop to think that the iPhone was invented only in 2007. And Facebook was, although it started in 2004 as a college student app, it really became a thing in our life in 2010, 2011, something when it really exploded. TikTok which is now used by 170 million people in the US and 2 billion people around the globe, half of America uses it, only started in 2016. And YouTube was 2005 or so. So we tend to forget that this technological revolution has been compressed into less than a generation, less than 20 years, which in the history of technology is a second or two. So imagine if you had been standing in, in Glasgow in 1769 next to James Watt, who just invented the steam engine, and you said to him, Jim, this is really cool. Do you realize that it's going to lead to urbanization, the development of electricity, several world wars? Who would have guessed, right? But it did. It was the basis for the Industrial Revolution. And I think we have a sense that technology is doing that now. It's creating things that we can't even begin to grapple with, but it's happening so quickly that we don't have the resources to address it.
Yeah, it's. I've heard a good metaphor, or just a good way of putting it, like the year 1000 and the year 15,000 or 1500. Oh, sure, there were some developments along the line there, but like largely the same. And then 1600 to 1700, as you go, that timeline compresses for them to become radically different. Now you look at 20th century versus 21st. I mean, these are different worlds.
Totally.
And my generation, I grew up in the 90s. I've lived this revolution in particular. Like I remember dialing up internet and just the early days of all that to now see like everyone online all the time. It's all right here.
Yep.
The whole world's knowledge in my hand every day from, I remember listening to the radio and recording to tape, and now I just go to YouTube and whatever song I want, it's right there. We all have these experiences. I just had the occasion this morning of cleaning out a bookcase with a bunch of books in it, including a couple of encyclopedias and dictionaries and things like that, reference books. It was a reference section. And I thought, I haven't opened these books in 5 years. And there was a time when I was constantly consulting them. Why? Because I'm taking out my iPhone, and if anything I need to know, I've got a Wikipedia answer in 2 seconds, and let alone, et cetera. So, and you used to have to know how to search for information with your iPhone.
Exactly.
Now it's just, let me pull up ChatGPT here and ask it.
Absolutely. Which has big implications for our intelligence community and government, et cetera. All fascinating things.
So the pace is frenetic, and maybe a pointed question. Maybe to draw on Jurassic Park. Everyone loves the scene of Jurassic Park. It's, can we slow down?
No. Let's start with that.
Should we slow down?
Probably not.
So then what can we do about this rapid pace around technology?
So I think it's unrealistic to think we can slow down or should slow down. I think the benefits of innovation, the benefits of globalization and interdependence are very significant. And there are geopolitical issues too. And what should our relationship be with China? That's an important topic too. I don't want to minimize that, but broadly speaking, I think the world is moving is going to continue to move to increased technological innovation. With the digital revolution becoming even more pervasive, we're going to see that as the internet.
And the pace should quicken.
The pace will quicken. And so then the question is, well, what are we going to do about it? We all have this sense that it's running out ahead of us. We recognize that, as with other technologies, whether it was electricity or other things we talked about before, electricity, the automobile, the airplane, we recognize there's safety issues as well as affirmative misuse issues with all of them, right?
Yeah.
So what are we going to do? So we're moving to, in this area of the digital revolution, we're moving to more regulation and greater imposition of liability. Those are twin pillars that were mentioned in the National Cyber Strategy issued about a year ago. And that's a novel thing for us when we talk about the internet. When the internet was formed, everyone said, keep your hands off it. Don't hurt this little baby. Let's see what it develops. We don't want regulation stifling it. There's even a section of the Communications Decency Act, the famous Section 230, that says that internet platforms are not liable for content because we didn't want to stifle things, et cetera. We're now wondering about if that was a smart move, but at least at the time that was the decision. So we're seeing the effects of very light regulation. And of course, America has always, in contrast to Europe, had a light regulatory touch. We don't want the government to be jumping in too much into the commercial sector. We tend to regulate things after an accident, right? After a problem, after a bridge collapses in Minneapolis, we start the interstate bridge a couple of years ago, we start inspecting bridges. After the 1906 famous Iroquois theater fire, when 600 women and children died, we said, oh my gosh, we need to have national fire codes, et cetera. So we regulate after the fact.
You could say we write a lot of our regulations in blood.
Sadly true. And there may be, not to say we want to have any loss of life or any tragedy, but that's a societal decision to balance the good. And we're never going to get it exactly right.
There's a cost to innovation.
Right. So we recognize all that. But we're now moving to a world where it's inevitable that we're going to have more regulation on the internet for both manufacturers and providers and as well as companies who will be subject to greater regulations. Companies are going to have mandatory cybersecurity requirements. Companies that produce products are going to have software and hardware are going to have to ultimately meet some of this. We're seeing Europe take the lead in this, a little bit China too, surprisingly. The United States has lagged, but we're moving in that direction. And also the imposition of liability, which is going to be really tricky because right now on my home computer, if I get hacked by somebody because there's a vulnerability in my Microsoft Outlook program, an unknown bug, right? I can't sue Microsoft. I mean, I could. I'm going to lose.
Right.
So I can't sue Microsoft. They're not liable for their bugs, and they're going to claim under the current law that they're not responsible for it. They did the best they could. They introduced a commercial product. They're not guaranteeing it's 100% safety. I don't know that we want to move to a world in which we make the Microsofts of the world guarantee 100% safety. That's probably not the right commercial outcome. Probably not good for our society generally. But we do need to move to some greater shifting of liability where right now the burden falls on you and me as users.
So we're not equipped.
We're not equipped. We're the wrong end to deal with cybersecurity. You know that from your own company, of course, which is why there are companies such as yours as acting as intermediaries to help end users. But even that, I mean, we should be pushing more of this burden onto the manufacturers in the first place. And so ultimately we'll get there.
Call this I don't know if it's a wide concept, but I've heard it talked about as a shifting left.
Yes.
Right. In that sort of chain of events where shift more of the responsibility left into the development, secure coding practices, et cetera,
right,
as opposed to assuming further down the chain where each step down that chain we get less capable.
Right. So left of boom as opposed to right of boom, as they
exactly.
say in the Homeland Security
but
area.
If
right.
we're
exactly.
going to some of my clients who are small manufacturing machine shops in rural areas and asking them, like, you guys should be prepared to defend yourselves against potential nation states. That's not tenable.
Right.
So
that's back to my Sony Pictures example.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Is regulatory or is regulation our main instrument to control this pace? Because we can't slow it down. We shouldn't slow it down.
I think it's a combination of a bunch of things. It's in no particular order, certainly greater regulation and smart regulation.
Are our regulators prepared? Are they capable of regulating this?
I think broadly, yes. We've got a lot of political challenges, so that's an issue. So when the EPA came out with a bunch of significant regulations, a bunch of congressmen criticized it for overreach, et cetera. So we got to get the political balance right. I'll leave the politics out of this for a second, but it's going to be important for our country to address this in a politically savvy way and recognize it's in everyone's interest to come up with smart regulations. We're going to develop some laws that in one way or another push a little bit of liability onto vendors, software and hardware vendors. I don't think 100% liability is the answer either, but we need to figure that out somewhere. There are all sorts of intermediate steps, such as like a cybersecurity good housekeeping seal of approval or something. Consumer education is a huge element of this. Teaching digital literacy to young people and understanding how they can get spoofed, what steps they need to take. So there's a whole range. So just as the reasons for cyber vulnerability aren't unique and limited to just one thing, there's multiple causes of it, right? That's true on the solution side. And in some ways, that's actually a good thing. It's more complex because we don't know we're not going to have a silver bullet, right?
Sure.
So we're not going to fix it if we could just do one thing, we're going to fix it. No, of course not. But the flip side of that is we can chip away at it a whole bunch of other ways, and a whole bunch of solutions coming together will have a significant effect. But no one thing is going to solve it. I guess what I would say on this is that on the cyber vulnerability area, we know the problem and we know the solution. This is not a case where we have a bunch of doctors standing around a patient saying this is a medical mystery. We have no idea what to do here. We know how to solve this problem. It would take money and lots of time, but this is a problem we've created. We know the problem and we can fix it.
We have access to the code.
Exactly. So over time, and I'm guessing we're talking a decade or two, we will by and large solve this cybersecurity vulnerability problem. I think the world will look a little different, I think, in terms of how we use the internet, greater levels of authentication. We'll have some probably international treaties on misuse of the internet, more regulation. So we'll move to a point where I think the cyber vulnerabilities will be somewhat attenuated. We're going to have greater risk because everything is really going to be digital then, right? So will the vulnerabilities. So it's not going to be a perfect solution. I think things will get worse before they get better, but I'm optimistic they'll get better.
Do you think the United States is poised to lead that change politically?
I think the United States is poised because of its force of example. It still is the beacon of freedom in the world, and it is the most innovative place in the world. And so I think we will continue to see the U.S. take the lead in this area. Obviously enough, we are beset with domestic great political divisions in this country, and that hampers our effectiveness. And I'm not making a political statement left or right.
Right.
Just the reality is, if we don't present a united front to the rest of the world, that's going to hurt our position as a role model. And so
it's a bit of that fourth implication you talk about too, the attacks on legitimacy of our democracy and things like that.
Disinformation, the attacks on our legitimacy, our own internal political divisions all sap our strength. They sap our legitimacy. At its worst case, disinformation, whether foreign or domestic, makes a significant percentage of the population wonder whether our government is up to it. Are our leaders really acting in good faith? Are they really competent? Are
Not just leaders, institutions.
Are institutions ready for the challenges? And if you start losing faith in that, or you start to think the judiciary is corrupt, or you start to think that Congress really can't do anything, that hurts us. And it prevents us from coming together. It has the potential, and I don't want to get political here, but academicians have talked about this. It leads to the potential, or sows some of the seeds for an authoritarian reaction. Because if you don't think your government is going to be responsible and solve the problems for your kids and your grandkids, you're going to be open to more dramatic solutions. And that's a danger that we have to deal with. And I'm not this is not about President Trump. It's not about politics left or right. This is just a basic political science 101. It's true in the United States or any other countries. And we've seen that for the last 2,000 years of organized society and civil government, going back to ancient Greece, et cetera. So that is deeply concerning, and we need to be on guard for the aspects of the digital revolution that contribute to that. But the flip side is it also offers lots of powerful solutions too. Right. So that's again something.
It's like the fire that we're fighting is getting increasingly intense.
Exactly.
The fire with which we can fight it can also be increasingly intense, and we have to pay attention
to both.
Absolutely
correct.
So that may be a good segue. I think I'm just going to kind of follow the thread of your op-ed, right?
Okay.
Talk about the ability to grasp, in our ability to reach. It's exceeding our ability to grasp it, right? And that's kind of the first implication that you bring up of the digital revolution. Second is this consistent and persistent state of cyber insecurity in cyber war that we're already in that can be kind of hard to explain to people who aren't in the cyberspace. Like we're feeling real kinetic impact of cyber vulnerability. Our adversaries can now do that.
Which is going to get worse. And we don't really have a good defense against it. Yes, we can improve cybersecurity defenses through your company, others, where we have better firewalls, zero trust architecture, all sorts of other things we can do to improve our defenses, and that'll help. That's part of the solution. But we don't really have a really good way of deterring the bad guys in the first place.
Right.
And yes, we can crack down on cryptocurrency and misuse of that, and that's a factor that'll help put a dent in the bad guys' behavior if they can't get their ransoms paid and converted into cash. But we don't, the original, when cyber warfare sort of first started with attacks on Estonia and Ukraine and whatever, academicians and others who study this sort of thought about nuclear deterrence as the model, as the analog. But it turns out that's not really good, right? Not really good in the sense of it's not a good predictor, because nuclear deterrence largely works because for the obvious reasons, right? So if no one's going to drop in addition to the moral issue, but no one's going to drop a nucular bomb because they know they could get one dropped on them. Exactly. So, but that's not true for the reasons we talked about with cyber. So yes, it's probably true that a true cyber attack that really causes kinetic effects, shuts down the national electric grid, shuts down the New York Stock Exchange, et cetera. Yes, that might well trigger.
Adversaries know that's the line they can't cross.
So they can't cross that. Wherever that line is, we don't know exactly.
They do seem to be pushing it.
But the fascinating part is below that threshold, wherever that threshold is, below that threshold, there's room for a ton of mischief, an immense amount of mischief, and tremendous societal cost, billions of dollars lost to cybersecurity. And so that is going to be the real challenge of dealing with that area of vulnerability right up to the level of the active threshold of war, and that's where we've got to come up with an international regime years away to prevent this. Deterrence alone isn't working. I mean, Russia attacks us with impunity in cyberspace, right? So does China. They've stolen all sorts of blueprints and information over the years. That's how China's built its own jet fighters and solar panels and everything, stealing from us left and right, all with impunity. There's almost no consequence to them, right? Our trade with China hit an all-time high 2 years ago, right? Over $800 billion of two-way trade, unaffected by the fact that they're ripping us off blind in cybersecurity. Yes, we complain about it. We indict a few people here and there, but they get away with it.
It can sometimes feel theatrical.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's a bit like a death by a thousand cuts. Like each of these things, it's disruptive, but it never crosses that threshold.
Exactly.
And when you first brought this up, I immediately went back to The West Wing. Right. Great show.
Yeah.
And one of the early episodes, I remember President Bartlett's talking about, what's the wisdom in a proportional response? And what is a proportional response to a cyber attack?
Right.
Is it, you attacked one of our hospitals, we're going to get 2 of yours, 10 of yours?
And of course, we're not going to do that. Even if a Russian ransomware gang attacks one of our hospitals or goes after United Health and gets all sorts of personal records of hundreds of millions of Americans, we're not, because of who the United States is, we're not going to attack a Russian insurance agency and spread information about them. We're not going to shut off the electricity in a hospital in downtown Moscow and see patients die on the operating table. That's not us. So we're constrained by and rightly so, by our own moral standards, and that's important.
It does create a very interesting challenge for leadership it can't continue to go like this. You can't not respond and let them just get away with it over and over and over. But what are your options?
Right.
I mean, you can't open kinetic warfare in response. Everyone would see that as unjustified in the current, current model. So I think you brought up the idea of there needs to be more of an international consensus around what's allowable.
We'll get there, but I think ultimately pure deterrence alone, pure cyber deterrence alone isn't going to work. Sanctions will have an effect. Criminal prosecutions will have an effect, small. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the development of sort of ethical humanitarian norms where we'll get to a point where it's just considered wrong to attack a hospital. or wrong to attack personal records of someone. We're not there yet. And we have a long way to go. Maybe it's unrealistic. Maybe we won't get there. But at the end of the day, relying just on cyber deterrence alone, that, oh, if they attack us, we'll attack them, we have a little bit of one hand tied behind our back in that regard. And just cyber attacks alone aren't all that effective. And by the way, we've seen that in the context of war, where Russia's massive cyber attacks against Ukraine in this horrific war have had an effect, absolutely. But what's really had an effect is old-fashioned bombs and missiles hitting their electric grid way more than cyber attacks. And trust me, they've tried with cyber attacks. So there's a limit to how much this can have.
So this being the second implication you brought up in your op-ed, that we're going to be in this ceaseless state of cyber insecurity and cyber war, seemingly only going to get worse.
Probably.
With the implications from the first implication of like new technology, apply AI, apply compounding capability to innovate to the conducting of warfare in the cyberspace. It just feels like this could really amp up very quickly. We already see impact on infrastructure, hospitals, et cetera. I can start to feel a little pessimistic. Like, man, a properly motivated and capable adversary can conduct a ton of damage to, the way our society operates. And a great quote that I can't attribute to anybody, but I remember it from a while ago. It was like, society is only ever 3 meals away from total chaos. You can disrupt the delivery of meals in today's cyber domain. Yes. It's just about how much reach can you gain. Like, a lot can happen.
Absolutely. And a couple thoughts. So one is the vulnerability of some of our national well-being depends. You opened up in your opening comment about the vulnerability of the private sector. The national well-being of our country depends in some ways on a handful of companies, which are very powerful because of technology. And that's a new phenomenon for us, because we already said the private sector bears the burden of cybersecurity defenses in terms of foreign attacks. And so, even in its heyday in, say, the 1960s, a mishap at General Motors, then the biggest company in the country, wouldn't have had much of an effect nationally. Oh, yes, it would have hurt things in Detroit, and it would have slowed car deliveries around the country, but it wouldn't really affect the GDP of the country. But today, imagine an attack that completely disables Google, MasterCard, Visa, the New York Stock Exchange, the interbank settlement system that allows Microsoft, Amazon, UPS, millions of vital packages delivered to hospitals and individuals and everything. So a cyber attack on one of these companies that has such a profound role in our national well-being could really be significant. And that's not something we're really prepared for. We don't have the resilience to deal with that. Now, I'm not saying that these companies are exceptionally vulnerable. They certainly spend a lot of money on cybersecurity. They take this very seriously.
Just have a massive attack surface.
But we have to recognize there's a vulnerability, and that is something that we're not really fully ready to address. And our strategy right now is largely have as good a defense as we can get and just hope and pray that it doesn't really lead to some horrific attack. But we couldn't rule out that possibility.
And that's one side of the private sector implication. The other is, I think of every sci-fi film I feel like I've ever seen where they never call a company by its name. They just refer to like the corporation. Like in a dystopian future,
yes,
it's the corporation. And it owns the whole planet and all this sort of stuff. And kind of feels like not just are we super dependent on, say, Amazon, and disruption by cyber attack would be problematic, but Amazon's power and influence because of how critical they are. I mean, they amass more power and wealth than probably most countries at this point, just through Amazon. And that's not an elected group of people necessarily. Right. I mean, the shareholders and whatnot. But what's the danger present there of these private sector organizations gaining so much power through this new digital revolution?
Well, look, like everything else we've talked about, there are pros and cons to it, right? There's incredible benefits we all get from Amazon, right? Being able to just sit.
I ordered something earlier today. It'll be here tomorrow.
Right. Just as you're stopped at a red stoplight.
I was in traffic.
You're in traffic. You click on something and order something.
That's right. I forgot to order this.
And you're disappointed that it's arriving tomorrow and not this afternoon, right? Okay.
Boy, that's so true.
So yes. So there obviously are all sorts of extraordinary benefits we get from these massive technologically oriented corporations. And they're important, and I don't want to minimize them at all, but there also are some exceptional vulnerabilities. So a misuse, whether it's of AI or something else, or cybersecurity vulnerabilities by one of these companies, could lead to bad outcomes. Fortunately, they're all managed by people acting in good faith, and we hope in the right way. But Europe is taking the lead in this area with more regulations, trying to address the power, particularly in the social media space, of companies that have amassed a tremendous position of influence and could influence public opinion, both because the European regulators are worried about not only the domestic abuses, but foreign misinformation and disinformation polluting the political atmosphere, misuse of AI. So we've seen Europe take the lead in this area. I imagine the U.S. will follow on some level. We'll have our own version of these kinds of regulations. And we are, United States has always had, really since the rise of major corporations in the robber baron era, a concern and manifest in antitrust laws about bigness. And we're sort of torn because bigness in itself isn't inherently evil, right? It's a good thing. It could lead to all sorts of more efficiencies,
sure,
greater utility, et cetera.
Pros and cons.
Pros and cons, like everything else. And yet, there is the potential for misuse. There's a potential for vulnerability. There's a potential for it being not available after we're all dependent upon it. And so our society has to grapple with that. And the point I've said earlier on, and I'm now repeating this, to use an old expression that my kids don't understand, like a broken record, right? When I ever said that,
I know that.
They have no idea. What's a broken record? What do you mean? Why things with grooves in it?
Vinyl's making a bit of a comeback.
It's making a comeback. So now they know what it is, right? Exactly. Or the other expression I heard the other day, someone said, well, let's roll back the tape on that, referring to an old football thing. Nobody rolls back tape anymore. But anyway.
Well, on the private sector sort of discussion that we're having in the United States, I mean, there's no better example I can think of right now than the debate around TikTok.
Absolutely. And my gosh, what a microcosm of issues to worry about. So it's got national security,
just like
social
great intersection of so many
social
things.
Media technology. Here's the world's fastest growing application on the internet. The world's fastest growing, 2 billion users, and it started in 2016 roughly, or late 2017. It's fascinatingly banned in China itself.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, TikTok is banned. There's a version called Douyin, which is a watered down, censored version of TikTok that's used in China. But TikTok itself isn't allowed in China. It's also not allowed in India after a famous rupture between the two countries. There were border hostilities a few years ago. They did not have as many users at the time. And India said, we're just banning it outright. And here in the United States, there's now a new law that in essence requires the corporate parent to sell it, the Chinese corporate parent to sell the app to an approved U.S. buyer or some other acceptable buyer or be banned. There's going to be absolutely a constitutional challenge to it. We can talk about that, et cetera. But it brings in one great example our concerns over a rising China and questions about how do we deal with the technological threat posed by China. That's part of it. Part of it is our concerns over social media. There are a lot of problems with TikTok having nothing to do with its Chinese ownership. There's all sorts of bad information available there. There's misinformation, disinformation. There's a concern about teen suicide and bad public health topics on TikTok about the validity of vaccines and other things. So it's has all the good and all the bad that you can imagine in humanity. It's used by 170 million people in the United States. Over half the population uses it, and that includes the federal government and state government. So the very people who are complaining about it are using it. And it's a tremendous value. I mean, there's a lot of, it's more than just, teenage kids doing dance routines,
stuff,
right?
yeah.
I mean, that's where it started, but now it's a tremendous source of information. And I'm not saying it doesn't have problems. It absolutely has problems. I don't have it. I don't use TikTok. I hope my kids don't use it. Not that they'd listen to their dad in the first place anyway, but so I definitely think it's a national security risk. It is owned by the Chinese government, it's owned by a Chinese company, which has to report to the Chinese government. There's a 2017 law on the books in China that says that basically every Chinese corporation has to assist in the national security in unlimited, undefined ways of China. And if the Chinese Communist Party said to TikTok at the time of the invasion of Taiwan, for example, hopefully that never occurs, give us the list of everyone who's using, all you American users of TikTok, or we want you to put this video on that disparages Taiwan or creates doubt in America as to whether it should support Taiwan. Those are quite legitimate concerns. I personally happen to think that it's absolutely right for us to ban TikTok on government phones, on military phones. If you work in the intelligence community, you shouldn't have it, et cetera. I totally think that's the right answer. It does present a risk. I think we've got real First Amendment issues, precedent issues. Do we want to be really banning a social media? Maybe this time it's China. Maybe next time it's a different one. We don't like that particular app. And then most important of all, around the world, going back to my comment earlier about America being a role model around the world. If we start banning TikTok, who do we look like? We look like China. We start to look like China. And it's just a bad thing. We're far better off coming up with a solution that can ameliorate 98, not 100, 98% of the risk, not going to be perfect, and still preserve our ability to go around the world and say we are the country of freedom and free expression. And the minute we start saying, well, we don't like that one and that one and that one and that one, it's a very slippery slope. Again, I recognize the risk of China. I'm not minimizing it in the slightest, but we have other tools at our disposal than just an outright ban. But it's a fascinating example of this tension, geopolitical tension, technological tension, all wrapped up in one app.
And the main debate there is just going to resolve potentially one source of tension.
Right.
You still have an app privately owned that half of the populace of the United States is using that could decide, hey, we're going to, across our platform, promote a particular viewpoint or a particular
What if the next pandemic they decide that the vaccines developed for the next pandemic aren't good and they want to publicize that and assume it's an American and assume they're doing it in good faith, right? Let alone bad faith. Are we going to say we don't like that content, take it down? Well, the First Amendment doesn't allow us to do that. There's very clear Supreme Court cases that say under the First Amendment, Americans have the right to foreign propaganda, even if it's wrong.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating, philosophical, political sort of approach, because misinformation can have a major impact to public safety and public health. Misinformation, I think we can readily say in the pandemic, killed people.
Yes.
People who would otherwise have survived that.
I mean, again, not making a political statement, but I think there's no question that some people didn't take a vaccine because they thought it was bad for them, and some of those people died. Now, we could talk about the public health benefits and this and that, but the reality is, or some people didn't wear a mask. They thought it was ineffective, and maybe it wasn't perfect, but it probably had some effect. And we'll never know the cost of it, but yes, there's clearly a cost to disinformation.
I think I probably settle where you do as well, though. I mean, I don't want to live in a society where TikTok's banned for me personally.
Right.
I don't use it. I have no interest in it.
Right.
But I like having the option, and I should have the option. I don't want everything filtered to me by way of a bureaucrat necessarily. At the same time, I mean, the danger this power poses, we're just going to have to get insanely creative to deal with these challenges. And I'll go back to the quote I used of yours, that doesn't feel like we're there.
No, I mean, a big part of it is also going to be, in addition to teaching digital literacy, is teaching civics again. it used to be the case years ago, particularly at the height of the Cold War, when we really wanted to push back against communism and show the American way of life being superior, that we had mandatory civic education in most of the states. The vast majority of states required civic education at the high school level, at least a half a year, if not a year. I don't know what the number is now. I looked at it recently. I think only 9 states, maybe some small amount. It's a tiny number. I don't know if that's the exact number, but it's a small number require a full year of civics at the high school level. It's getting a little better. Now, part of that is attributable to the increase in STEM education, where we started pushing more science, and it crowded out the curriculum. There's only so many hours in a day, so civics sort of fell by the wayside. It wasn't that critical, or so it was perceived. I think we're paying the price for that now. We now recognize it. But we have some of these Pew surveys that show that an astonishing percentage of America, I think perhaps half, something half of it, can't even name the three branches of the United States government, the three fundamental branches of the United States government. And we even have a U.S. senator who was misquoted, that where it was quoted as not knowing all the U.S. branches of government. So when we have a situation where civics education is at such a low point, it's no wonder that we have trouble coming to agreement. And I'm not making a Republican or Democratic point, or whatever, but just if you don't have basic civic understanding of how governments work, the checks and balances, how compromise is needed, it's very easy for people to retreat to their respective corners and not come to agreement, not come to solutions, and then ultimately, in the worst case, doubt the very ability of government to find those solutions to these problems we've been talking about.
One of the specific problems that's front of mind for me, it goes back to where the pace of technology is moving so quickly. I sometimes feel like cybersecurity as an industry, we can come off very alarmist. Mm-hmm. Like we're constantly saying, oh man, this is, TikTok.
Right.
It's felt a little alarmist at times. Like, do they really care what kids are doing, on their dance videos and whatnot? Similarly, AI has become something that there are a lot of alarms being raised about. I wonder where you fall on that right now. Is it the potential threat it seems to be? Is it not quite as advanced as we may imagine?
You're talking about AI in particular?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the answer is yes.
Yes, should we be
yes to a little bit of everything?
Could be.
So, look, we've although the advent of Chat GPT just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, really brought this to the public consciousness. We've been using AI, machine learning, for decades. This is nothing new. Whether it's basically controlling traffic signals or something else. But we've been using computerized assisted ways of making decision based on information, of historic information, and using it to make decisions about current operations for decades. So that's nothing new. What is new is the ability, both for generative AI as well as the applications we're using it in, to substitute for human decision making. And obviously there's lots of benefits to that. So every minute, I don't know the number, but it's several thousand or several hundred thousand hours of content is uploaded to YouTube. There's no way you could have millions of people looking at each
Can't
video
be moderated
to make sure there's no pornography, to make sure there's no illicit drug references, terrorist references. So it all has to be done by AI. And frankly, AI does a pretty good, not perfect, pretty good job of that. So we absolutely need AI. It's essential it's critical to our advancement in the digital revolution. And I think it has rich, fabulous potential. I think some of the hype over it is about its use is a little much, but I also think there's a little bit of too much screaming that the sky is falling and this is going to be terrible and the world is going to come to an end. We're going to have computers that will, or artificial intelligence that will bring about the end of humanity, and et cetera, et cetera. Or is that possible? Could we envision a world with autonomous weapons that make up their own decisions to who to kill? Yeah, we could envision. I don't think we're going to get there.
Well, it feels like we're close to that. If you watch what's going on with drones and their impact on war.
Okay, there's absolutely cause for concern. I'm not minimizing that, but I'm just saying I don't think it's a black or white. It's a little more nuanced picture. There's lots of potential, and also tremendous potential for misuse and disuse.
So maybe Skynet is not tomorrow. It's conceptually possible, but we shouldn't be so concerned of it today. And I think anyone that actually is using ChatGPT in their real life can see, okay, it's not all powerful.
Right.
It's pulling from data, and
Right.
there's a lot of bad data out there. It's making projections.
It's good for summarizing what exists.
Right.
It, at least as of now, doesn't have the ability to create, in the sense of, yes, it can put together a sentence that hasn't been used before. So in that sort of trivial sense, it's creating, but it isn't coming up with new ways of thinking, new stratagems, et cetera. So that's still a human endeavor. Of course, AI scientists will debate back and forth whether that's ever going to be possible or not. Leave that debate aside. But right now, that's not the case. And we still need human minds and human ingenuity and human empathy and human values to guide all this. And the task is going to be to make sure those are inculcated and put into these systems. And without it, yeah, they could run amok, but hopefully we'll recognize that.
So we're clearly in the midst of this revolution. We've already talked, the cat's out of the bag, toothpaste is out of the tube.
Right.
It's not going back in. The only way through is forward. And a lot of what we've discussed, I think, would impact political level, leadership level, nation state level of how we should respond to it. For those of us who are in the weeds of it, who are practitioners, whether in cybersecurity or IT or computer science, what would you say to us? What should we be doing? Or is there anything we can do as day-to-day practitioners to help prepare either ourselves or our community, our society at the individual level for this, and guide it through?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. So I think each of us has an individual responsibility in this area across a wide range of factors here. I think we all do have a responsibility to do the best we can for cybersecurity for ourselves, our businesses, our families, et cetera. So remain vigilant in that area. Yes, it's not just, it's too big a problem, I'm not going to deal with it. So we do have a responsibility there. I think we also have a responsibility to vet information that we rely on, and when we take actions, whatever those actions are in our personal lives or commercial lives, to make sure we're acting on reliable information. That requires a bit of education, requires pause for a second before you just click and forward on something on a video or whatever to your friends. Maybe you want to think about it. In our business and professional lives, we need to recognize that we're going to have to spend a lot of time on some basic building blocks that aren't maybe all that sexy or exciting, but we need to do that. We need to spend more money, resources on cybersecurity generally. We need to educate a lot more and train a lot more people in the cybersecurity area. There's a whole range of things we need to do. Again, no one thing is going to make a difference, but I think each of us does have an individual responsibility in this area to be a good citizen in the digital age.
Yeah, I try not to be too cynical, and you'll love the way we posed the final question in our conversations. We're not there quite yet, but I do struggle sometimes to see that I can have an impact as an individual. Now, in my role, I lead a team, so I do see the changes in a team, and we advise clients and whatnot. But sometimes I find it just still sometimes feels like we're talking to walls. Right, like there's not a whole lot of buy-in from leadership or executives, or there hasn't been enough, almost like there hasn't been enough blood involved in cyber attacks yet for people to really get it. Like we're still trying to explain to people why basic cyber hygiene is necessary, but we're also having to pay attention to the bleeding edge of AI and prepare for its impact on the world. It can be hard to feel like there's much I can do there.
Well, yes and no. So yes, I recognize the point you made about there's this, to go back to my metaphor before, this giant wave about to crash over us, and we're a little powerless to deal with it. So I certainly understand that feeling. But again, I go back to my point that lots of individual solutions to addressing these vulnerabilities and these risks. And while no one thing is going to solve it, increased cybersecurity, more civic education, digital literacy, more responsible political behavior, all these things are going to have a role. And we need to, at the end of the day, it's all about more education. But I do remain generally optimistic in this area, but we're in for some tough sledding first.
Yeah, and you did say earlier you think it might get a little worse before
I think in cybersecurity it is. Yeah, I think even though we've made great strides in the last, say, 5 years, especially since the SolarWinds incident for the federal government. And another thing is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You remember immediately afterwards there was all sorts of talk about, Russia's going to be attacking the United States in retaliation for its support of Ukraine. And so every Chief Information Security Office in the United States was bombarded with information from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security about Shields Up campaign, you may remember, and be on lookout. So we've had some instances and incidents where this has come to the public attention. So everyone knows about the problem. Solving it is another thing, but at least people are now aware, broadly speaking, of the problem. We're making great strides. Having said that, the bad guys are a little bit ahead of us. So we're moving at 80 miles an hour. The bad guys are moving at 100, and they started ahead of us.
Can we catch up?
I think we'll ultimately catch up because we're getting faster. We're getting better, and we are getting better. And I think we're getting better a little faster than they're developing the bad stuff. So I think ultimately, and by that I mean 5-10 years, we will catch up. Because again, it goes back to my fundamental point. We know how to solve this problem. This is not an insoluble problem. If we spend enough time and enough money, we can fix it. We obviously, to take a ridiculous example, but an analogy, in the automobile area, we were talking about that before, we know how automobile accidents occur. We could bring automobile accidents down to zero. Everyone would drive a Sherman tank. No one would get injured.
It'd be fun.
Right? Okay. But no, we wouldn't have any car accidents.
Road rage would be pretty
right. Okay.
awful.
But you know what I'm talking about. But we could fundamentally cushion everybody in a giant
we could
piece of
disconnect
armor.
from the internet.
Right. So we know how to solve this problem. The question is there a way to do it that is going to continue to allow the innovation and the utility, the functioning, without crimping? And we don't want to crimp that. And yet we want to increase the safety. I think we can. I think we're getting there. We're getting a little better. Some of the things I talked about before, regulation, liability, greater public awareness, companies like yourself getting more involved, teaching their clients, et cetera. So I think we will catch up to the bad guys in this area. We're never going to completely surmount it. We're never going to fix the problem perfectly. It's a chronic condition we're going to have to live with. It's not a disease that we're going to cure in just one second, or when we're not going to. There's no, back to my comment. There's no silver bullet. We're not going to cure the thing and say, okay, we're done. It is a chronic condition, but you can live with chronic conditions and you can get the better of them.
I spend a lot of time talking about these topics, especially on on our podcast here. We talk to a lot of folks who are involved in national security and cybersecurity, and there's so much challenge that we discuss. Sometimes you can end a conversation feeling a little pessimistic. As I mentioned, you can feel a little cynical. You've already expressed optimism.
Yes.
And the way I always love to close out our podcast is tell me about what keeps you optimistic against this backdrop that can feel pretty dangerous and pretty scary. What puts that smile on your face when I ask that question?
A bunch of things, which is good. In no particular order. One is America's ingenuity and spilling of and spirit of entrepreneurship and innovation, which has been a hallmark of this country since its founding, right? That's why the country was established in some respects. Its very strong desires for freedom, for making sure the role of government is properly balanced so that it doesn't affect innovation and ingenuity. And America, is the role model for the world, broadly speaking. So that's one factor. The second is, I think, our government, broadly speaking, is well positioned to deal with this. Yes, there's lots of problems on any given day. It's easy to be pessimistic about how Congress hasn't adopted privacy legislation yet, even though other industrialized democracies have, how they haven't regulated AI, even though Europe is off running that. So on any given day, it's always easy to point to things. But by and large, although we're in a tough spot right now with a very polarized government and country, by and large, we have the institutions that have enabled us to withstand other crises. And I continue to believe, I hope I'm not Pollyanna-ish about it, I continue to believe that those institutions are up for it. I think there is a question, although you haven't asked it, of whether our government is properly structured for the digital age, and it probably isn't, and we could spend some time on that, but that's for another day. But broadly speaking, I think the checks and balances systems we have in our government, the ability to recognize that when a problem exists, our nation needs to rise to confront it and confront it in a good way, we're pretty good at that. And for a variety of reasons, we've been slow to catch up to the misuse and disuse of the internet and recognize the problems of the digital revolution, whether it's our hesitancy for regulation, our feeling that, the bad stuff is just a single thing, it's not systemic, it is, it's not really a big problem, and a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case. I think we're now recognizing that. I think we're moving in the right direction. I don't want to make it sound like I'm dismissing all the problems. They're very significant, and we shouldn't minimize them in the slightest. And they are going to be difficult. And the next several years are going to be difficult in the digital revolution. But long term, I do remain optimistic.
Good. And for someone in my seat who's sitting across from you, knowing what you know, not that I know what you know, I know how much you know. The fact that you can remain optimistic is like, okay, cool. I can take a little breath. Like every time I talk to someone who's been doing it, is in deep, and they're like, no, don't worry. We're going to get through this. It's
well, I don't know if I'd say don't worry. I'd say worry a little bit.
Right. Don't get complacent about it.
Don't get complacent. Definitely worry about it, but don't freak out. How about that?
I like that. And it's a good way to end it. Don't freak out. Well, Glenn, it's been a pleasure. We didn't even get to talk about some of the things that, we could have spent a whole day on.
Sure.
Let alone your background and how you end up in that seat, being able to educate us on so many different topics. Maybe a topic for another time.
Okay,
so we'll have to have you back. But
thank you.
Really appreciate you coming on.
This has been fun.
Is there any social media or book or publication or other media you want to plug that where people can find you or read you or anything like that you want to talk about?
Well, no. I mean, I do have a website, which is just my name. You can just plug it into the internet and get Glenn Gerstell. But I'm retired. I'm not looking for. I'm on boards of advisors here and there and do some consulting, but I'm not generally out looking for business. I'm trying to spend some time with grandchildren and balancing still being involved in national security and cybersecurity. And so I'm trying to get that balance right.
Well, awesome. Well, congrats on the retirement.
Thank you.
And that sounds like time well spent with family. So
yep, all good.
Well, we appreciate you taking time away from that to come sit down with me.
All important topics. And thank you for doing this too.
Yeah. Well, it's been
great.
Been my pleasure. And I've been learning a lot. And so we're going to continue on.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.